Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Noelle Galley. I am a McGill grad from 2013, and I've been running the San Francisco chapter for a few years now. And I'm very excited to have with me today Matt Altro and Pavan Dhillon. We will be covering today our second part of traveling back to Canada, this time focusing specifically on what it means to immigrate to Canada in this time, what you need to know. And we have two great experts today, both McGill grads, that I'm very excited to introduce. So first, to begin, I'll ask each one to say a few words to introduce themselves, and then they have a presentation they will share with us. After the presentation, we will have a Q&A time, so if there are things that we haven't answered, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and we will address them at the end of this call. So without further ado, Pavan, could you kindly say a few words?
Great, thank you, Noelle. Hi, everyone. My name is Pavan Dhillon. I am from Vancouver, but went to McGill between 2000 and 2004. And since 2012, I've been practicing Canadian immigration law in the United States. I recently opened my own practice in San Francisco, and I practice solely Canadian immigration. So I'm looking forward to giving you some tips based on some of the questions I've been receiving in my office. Thank you.
Matt, please go ahead.
Great. Well, thanks for that, Noelle, and the opportunity to be part of this great panel and discussion with McGill grads. It's nice to reunite in this virtual way. I also am a McGill grad, as Noelle mentioned, graduated in 2000 out of management, and went into actually got a job at Accenture for 6 years, thanks to the McGill Management Career Center and the great work they do there. And then eventually found my way into a very interesting career in cross-border tax and financial planning. And it's been the past 15 years as we've developed our expertise as cross-border experts. And I think no more than now has been more important and more interesting, with so many Canadians coming back from the US, moving back for all the reasons that have been important over the last few years. And today we're happy to be able to talk a bit more about that and give you a little bit of introduction to our team as well. So I'm the president and CEO of CMA CrossBorder Advisors, and we have professionals who are licensed on both sides of the border. I'm myself a certified financial planner in Canada and the US, and also a Quebec Financial Planner, and doing Masters in US tax, and we have CAs and CFAs and other CFPs on the team, and we come together to deal with these issues. And so we'll talk more about that, get right into it today, when we're talking about you guys who are living in the US and thinking of coming back. The way I like to think about this on the next slide is thinking about what drives the planning. What is going to drive the planning issues related to your move back to Canada? Well, it's usually the US status. That is a big trigger point to think about how we look at this. Are you a US citizen? Some of you are who are attending. So are you a visa holder, just there on a job, H-1B, L1, whatever it might be, or are you a green card holder? And you might be one, but your spouse might be something else. So we really have to think about that as a starting point. And why that's so important is it's the differences in the US and Canadian tax system. And if we look on the next slide, you'll see that Canada and the US are very different in the sense that Canada taxes based on residency. Kind of makes sense. If you're living in Canada, you're taxed on your worldwide income. It's logical. If you move away, you're done with Canada for taxes, as most of you are living in the US. You're not reporting tax in Canada unless you're Canadian source income, which is like rental income, employment income, but mostly you're done with Canada. On the US side, okay, this is what's unique. The IRS taxes based on citizenship. And that could be problematic because for US citizens or US taxpayers who move back to Canada, you may end up having to deal with taxes on both sides of the border. And I often say US citizens living in Canada have the worst of both worlds because they have to come back to Canada and now pay tax at Canadian rates, the high Canadian rates, right? We're known for what? Taxes, hockey, and Tim Hortons. So, you know, it's all three. You can't get one without the other. So you're going to have to pay tax at higher Canadian rates. But then if you're a US citizen, you have to go ahead and still file and report your worldwide income to the US. So you pay the higher Canadian taxes, you then file and report your US taxes. because the Canadian taxes are higher, you should get a foreign tax credit to offset the US taxes owing. And that's if everything works out nicely, okay? But things don't always work out nicely. Unfortunately, there's a whole bunch of income tax traps that exist, okay? And these are things that work in one country but don't work in the other country. And unfortunately, they can be set by professionals who don't specialize on both sides of the border, maybe an accountant, maybe a lawyer, maybe a financial planner, and they're just giving you the advice for that side of the border. But we know that there's these traps, that things that work on one but don't work on the other. Now, an example of that, a couple classic examples for you today. First one is the TFSA. If anybody, a lot of you have probably heard of this, even though it may have been created while you've been in the US. There's this now a tax-free savings account in Canada, which is kind of, it's like a no-brainer. You put after-tax money and it grows tax-free, very flexible on the Canadian side. Most Canadian residents have them. You can do $6,000 a year, but what have you done on the US side if you do that? Well, unfortunately, you've created a foreign trust for US purposes. And a foreign trust is a complicated concept which requires complicated filings every year. As we slide here, we say 3520 and 3520A are forms that are required each year. Penalties for not doing them are exorbitant, very scary numbers. And even if you hire a firm like ours who would do them for you, the income is still taxable, okay? So it kind of defeats the purpose on the US side. For the US citizen living in Canada, this is a problem. So generally we say don't have a TFSA. The next issue is that the IRS doesn't like when its taxpayers invest in foreign mutual funds or foreign ETFs. Okay, there's this concept called, it's a harsh and confusing, on the first slide, back the slide, on the slide before, please. There's a harsh and confusing part of the Internal Revenue Code called, a harsh and confusing part of the Internal Revenue Code called passive foreign investment company. That's defined there, okay? And if you have what we call a PFIC, which is, passive foreign investment company, then you end up having to do two problems. One, you have to do an annual filing every year, the Form 8621, which is complicated and expensive to do. And then even if you do that, then you have very punitive tax consequences. So, generally speaking, we'll say that US citizens living in Canada should stay away from Canadian mutual funds, Canadian ETFs, because of these onerous and complicated tax consequences. So something as simple as a mutual fund or an ETF can be a problem. And there are, now some of you are getting stressed, and maybe some of you are thinking you might even have some of these things, even though you're living in the US. One thing I can say is if it's in your RSP, it's from PFIC, so that's a good thing. But we have to come up with strategies on how to mitigate against PFIC once you come back to Canada with your brokerage account, what to do with it, how to avoid these things. And there's a bunch of different workarounds that, depending on your situation, we should look at. Okay, next slide. Basically, the next slide, we just want to touch on here that in addition to these PFIC issues, if any of you have actual companies like on the US side, an LLC, an S Corp or C Corp, there's quite a bit of complexity involved there. We have to look at that in advance and figure out, well, what are the US and Canadian implications of coming to Canada with these kinds of structures, especially the LLC, because it is looked at as a flow-through entity in the US, but a corporation in Canada, so you have a problem. Or if you're trying to set up a company in Canada, maybe you're going to be thinking about setting up a professional corporation, or you just have a business. What does it mean for a US person to have a Canadian business? And there's all kinds of complexities there. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on this slide, but there's a lot to discuss if that is in part of your situation. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. I'll just talk about what's in the next slide. So the next slide, oh, there it is. So now we talked a little bit, we talked about the US citizen and the issues of facing the US citizens. Well, what about the other statuses? Well, bad news about the green card holder is that all the issues I just said about citizenship applies to green card holders too. So if you're a green card holder living in Canada, you're also subject to tax on your worldwide income, okay? So the green card is a very interesting position to be in. And some of you are listening right now thinking that you've got a green card in your pocket and what's gonna happen to that thing. And I've talked to many clients about this, and there's really three options, and there's probably more than three, but I like three, it keeps it simple. you either A, become a citizen before you move back, okay, and that sort of locks in your ability to travel and not have to worry about, you know, your green card expiring or becoming or abandoning it. The second one is you give up the green card before you move back. If you do that, you're not going to be subject to the US tax system anymore. So that can be a very good thing, provided that you're comfortable giving up your green card. And a lot of you know it's taken a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to get one of those things. So you may or may not want to do that. Now, if you do give up your green card, there can be some tax impacts depending on how long you've held it and what your net worth is. There can be a tax event on certain cases. We'll have to talk about that. And then the last choice is an interesting one, which is you maintain the green card, and that requires you to get a re-entry permit to keep the green card active, which you can do potentially for a couple years, and it's an interesting option in certain cases where you're not sure if, like, let's say you're the Canadian, you know about what it's going to be like in Calgary winters, but your spouse doesn't, and they're not sure yet. So they may not want you to give up your green card because they may say you have to move back with me if you don't like it after the winter. So there's interesting options there. If you're just a visa holder, well, your visa will expire with your job ending, and there won't be any tax issues about giving that up, which is great. So there's certain opportunities that we can play the US and the Canadian tax system off each other there, and there's planning that we can think about in that case as well. So again, US status drives planning. Let's sort of move to the next slide and talk about a very important topic that I'm sure you're all thinking about, which is residency. I'm not going to spend too long on this. It's not that much time today, but the tax residency is a unique concept, and a very nuanced concept. Some of you are thinking, well, what makes me a resident and what triggers that? Well, it's usually fact driven, and there's rules about Canadian tax residency, and there's rules about whether you're US tax resident, and often there's an overlap. We have clients who end up resident under the domestic law of both countries. So in that case, that's common. It kind of worries you, like, am I going to be double taxed? Well, fortunately, we have the Canada-US tax treaty that does a good job, like traffic cop, of ensuring you're only a resident of one country or the other, not both. And we have to look at your facts and how the treaty examines that and what are the trigger points to determine when is the optimal time of you to transition to Canadian residency, drop US residency. And again, we don't have time to go into it, but the key is to be proactive with that. Don't just fall into residency. We plan for it and then align all the facts so that you can substantiate that if one of the tax departments came out and wanted to have a look. So to the next slide, I really want to get in this last bit on the retirement accounts, because most of you have been working, busting your butt down there, doing a great job in tech or in finance or whatever, and building up your 401ks and your IRAs, and now feeling what's going to happen to this when I come back to Canada. So again, here's the three options, because it's clean and simple. There's three. I like to think of what your options of what to do with these accounts when you move back. First one is, well, you could keep them there. Let's say you built up 500K in your 401k. You could keep it there, and ultimately the US will allow you to keep getting the tax deferral benefits, and so will Canada, which is a good thing. But when you take the money out, you're going to pay tax at the higher Canadian rate. Okay, not too bad. It's an option. There is two other interesting options that maybe could do better than that. The second one is transferring it from the 401k. There is possible to do it through a series of steps to transfer it from a 401k to an RSP. This is the hand motion I've developed to show that. 401k to an RSP. Now, it's not that easy to do. It's easy to do the hand motion, not that easy to accomplish, because there's quite a bit of complexity in there, and there can be certain people that would be double taxed. But for some people, it will work well. And some people want it back in Canada because they're comfortable with money in Canada, in Canadian dollars. So that's an option worth examining. But finally, the last choice is really strong and really, really worth going deep dive on, which is moving money from the 401k or an IRA, converting it to a Roth IRA before you move back. Okay, why would you do that? Well, going from a pre-tax account of a 401k to an after-tax account of a Roth IRA triggers the tax. But in a case where somebody is going to be at a higher tax rate in the future than they are now, this can be very powerful. And for most US retirees, that's not the case. Usually you're going to be in a lower income, lower tax environment later on when you retire. But in this cross-border playground that we all play in, which is that you may be moving back to Canada, this is your situation. You're going from a lower tax jurisdiction in the US to a higher one in Canada very soon. And so we have to do a deep dive to look at, does it make sense to convert some of the money now, pay some tax now earlier than you planned, but at a lower rate before you move back and you're stuck at the Canadian high tax rates. So really interesting, and there can be quite a powerful tax savings involved there, and definitely want to dig into that with you guys. In conjunction with this last bullet I'm going to touch on before I turn it over to Pavan, which is if you also have RSPs in Canada, it's really interesting and really beneficial to know, I love sharing this with people, that you can get money out of your RSP at a much lower tax rate as a non-resident than you could as a resident. So I guess I'm the only Canadian resident on the right here, but as me, the Canadian resident, if I took money out of my RSP and I'm at the top rates, I'm looking at in Quebec 54%. As a non-resident like you guys, you can get money out of the RSP at 25 or even 15%. Okay, now there's different ways to do it, and there's different reasons to do it, and the question of whether to do the Roth and the RSP, you really have to look at all those scenarios of what would be your retirement situation if you left the money in option one all the way through retirement, your after-tax net worth throughout the years versus converting versus pulling money out of the RSP. So it can be really a big opportunity, but the point is you need time to plan this before you move back. That's why it segues into my last point here, which is before my last slide, which basically is saying that there's a lot of different issues around moving to Canada or to the US, either way, which we do both. And what clients want from us to develop what we call a cross-border financial plan that pulls all the issues together. Again, just highlighted a few today, but tax residency, tax retirement planning, tax analysis on that, estate planning we didn't touch on, but important, investment transition with your portfolio, insurance issues, healthcare coverage in both countries. So all this stuff needs to be looked at, examined, planned out, and if we get the opportunity, we look to discuss, hopefully discuss this in more detail, either in the Q&A later on or together in the future. But that's it for my part, and now I'm going to transition over to my colleague Pavan, who's going to talk about more in detail about these very important immigration rules and immigration strategies of moving back to Canada.
Great, thank you. That was excellent and very informative. I know anytime someone reaches out to me about the time frame for moving to Canada, the first thing I say is you need to speak to Matt in many times, because it is actually really an important consideration and something that dictates when you're moving a lot. The other thing that dictates moving is processing times in immigration, which I will get to. But thank you, Matt. So I'm going to break up my presentation into two separate sections. The first is going to be dealing generally with travel restrictions, because they are going to be here for some time. They were just recently extended, actually, until December 21st for anybody entering from the United States, and for the rest of the world until January 21st. And I think the goal there is to really organize the orders that are coming out, which have been a little bit haphazard. The other thing that was just recently extended was the mandatory self-quarantine period. So I'll be talking about that as well. So since March 18th, I've had many more Canadians as my clients than I've ever had living in the United States. And that's because we've, for the first time, been subject to travel restrictions ourselves. But all of the laws that have come out are really based on the Quarantine Act and a protective mechanism, of course. So they are usually rolled out in 30-day increments, but now we're seeing them align a little bit more. But I think it's going to be around for the near future. So broadly speaking, and this was a source of confusion in the beginning, especially, but Canadian permanent residents, their immediate families now are able to enter Canada with dependent on certain rules, but Canadian citizens and permanent residents have the right to enter. So that's an important consideration, is obviously you need to carry proper documentation for that. But the immediate family exemption came out as well. So that's the one topic that I'll talk about. And then I'll move on to extended family members. Now, this was quite the big deal in immigration because it took some time from March until October. Extended family was not included. And then everyone else may enter, but it needs to be for an essential or otherwise known as non-discretionary, non-optional purpose. And those individuals who are not Canadians and permanent residents need to be asymptomatic in order to gain entry. So I'll start first with immediate family members. Immediate family members who aren't Canadians or permanent residents can enter if they're asymptomatic. They have to show that they're entering for at least 15 days. Obviously, if you're moving back to Canada, it's important to make sure that you are able to prove that you'll be there for at least 15 days. So there's no advanced approval that's required for immediate family members. This is based on the assumption that you will meet the general entry requirements to enter Canada. But the people who are included are spouses, common law partners, dependent children, and also parents or step-parents, as well as guardians. Now, one of the most important things to consider is what documentation you need to bring. So it's very straightforward if it's a spouse, a parent, or a child. You would carry the appropriate certificates, marriage, birth. But when it's a common law partner, it's a little bit more involved, and you'd have to carry a lot more information and documentation showing that you've been together. And there's also an application form that you can carry that can be notarized as well. So that's essentially all you really need for the travel restrictions. For extended family, it's a little bit more complicated, and that's the next slide, please. Thank you. And so these are individuals who also need to be asymptomatic, also need to show that they're entering for at least 15 days, but they also need to obtain written authorization. Now, it's the extended family is also very narrow. It's only individuals who are in an exclusive dating relationship, non-dependent children. So now you can have adult children come visit you, grandchildren, and siblings as well, and then grandparents. So these are all extended family members that are now included. And I'm not going to spend too much time going into the details for this because many of the extended family members won't be sponsored by you, but I did want to draw to your attention that an approval is necessary. In terms of processing times, I wasn't sure what to expect, but we've been really pleasantly surprised. They're taking less than a week to get approved, so that's great. The other thing I would state is that although it says you just need to provide the form, if you do have any extended family members that need to come into the country, I'd strongly recommend that you submit with that form a lot of evidence confirming that they meet the family relationship as well. So I'll move now to the quarantine requirement because that impacts everyone that's coming into the country until at least January 21st. And it's expected to be extended once again. So everyone entering Canada, boarding a plane, they need to go through a health check. They need to plan to quarantine for 14 days. There is an exception in Alberta that has a pilot program for rapid testing, but you need to have a self-quarantine plan that details how you will quarantine, and you must wear a mask. Now, as of November 21st, you need to download the Arrive Can app. It was previously a recommendation, now it's a requirement. But there's a lot of questions that you'll anticipate receiving when you enter the country. A lot of them are health related to make sure that you don't have any symptoms. But a lot of them are focused on the quarantine plan. And the quarantine plan is relatively straightforward, I would say. You want to use the app, but I highly recommend also carrying something in writing that really confirms how you will quarantine. And the reason that I suggest doing this is because you will, even if you carry it, it's not like the officer is just going to review it and not speak to you any further. They're going to ask you questions about it, and you need to be able to verify that you have a solid quarantine plan. Now, the way that I present these plans is to have them broken down into 3 parts: before, during, and after. So before, you're doing, like, what steps did you take to protect yourself and others, follow the rules. During quarantine, you really want to focus on what type, where you will stay. There was a lot of questions about whether you can stay with someone or you have to have a separate Airbnb. The real the most important factor is your ability to to physically distance yourself during that time period, and that's like 2 meters apart. So as long as you can have that and you can have your own bathroom, have your own kitchen, those are ideal if you can. So and of course not to self-quarantine with somebody who's over 65 is also a requirement. You can receive consent from those individuals, and we would recommend that that be in writing. You can switch slides too, please. And I just wanted to also touch upon the fact, because I get this question several times, it's very difficult to get an exemption from the self-quarantine requirement. It's really reserved for those who are performing an essential service in Canada. So essential service providers, even if you're a doctor or a nurse who are coming into Canada, as long as you have to be providing that service in Canada in order to qualify for that exemption. There is, as of just recently, this also a compassionate grounds opportunity. So if you have to attend a funeral, I know that there have been some really difficult cases where situations where individuals weren't able to attend the end of life ceremony for one of their loved ones. So that has come about. So they are getting a little bit more flexible in that sense, as long as you can provide some sort of justification. And I think we can move over to sponsorship now. Great, thank you. So I'm going to speak. As we mentioned earlier, you know, there's a lot of factors that will go into determining how you will move back to the country and when. There's some things that you need to know for any type of application. There's two types. Next slide, please. For sponsorships, and that is an inside Canada or inland, depending on who you're talking to, or an outside Canada, an outland application. The inside and outside actually refers to where they're processed versus where the individual is focused or is based. So for inland sponsorship, the process is for partners that are living in Canada and any dependent children, and those the foreign national needs to be physically present in Canada, and that needs to be their place of residence during that time period. So this really, the main benefit of this one is work. So if you need to work in Canada, if your spouse or partner needs to work in the country for a Canadian company, then you would want to pursue this option because there is a work permit option that is aligned with this. The other thing to note is that there is no right to appeal from within the country for the Inside Canada application. It's only a judicial review. So the Outside Canada application used to be heavily preferred because of processing times. It was significantly faster, as you know, we'll discuss throughout this period. The main issue is right now is that the government has, for many Canadian immigration applications, we have electronic filings. For spousal sponsorships and family sponsorships, we don't. So what that means is that when there was the lockdowns in certain parts of the country, you had a lot of a huge backlog of and unfortunately spouses and family members were one of the ones that were more severely impacted. So when we used to be able, just to give you an example, we used to get an acknowledgement of receipt within 4 to 5 weeks. Now it can take over 5 to 6 months. So that is something to consider, and also goes back to why tax is also an important consideration. The Outside Canada application, the other reason that it is preferred is mainly, so there's the processing times, but it's also the ability to travel whenever, and also have much more flexibility in terms of where you want to reside during the processing period, which may make a difference. But next slide, please. So I'm going to go through these considerations. These are the things that I would say in addition to what you need to know about moving back to Canada from an immigration perspective, these are some of the most important considerations. So I'll start first with where the individuals are located. So next slide, please. So if the Canadian citizens are the only ones that can sponsor family from outside the country. If you're a permanent resident, you have to be inside Canada in order to sponsor. So that's an important first consideration. And so if you're outside Canada and your spouse is outside Canada, then you are going to be processed under the outside Canada application process. But if you then move into the country, then and when I say you, I mean the sponsor. When the sponsor is inside Canada, then they can use either approach, but they can only use the inside Canada application if the principal applicant, who is the foreign national spouse, is also residing inside Canada. You can travel, and then that's the next slide, please. But it does, because there is, unlike the United States where you don't have dual intent for all statuses, in Canada you do have dual intent, so you can be a temporary resident and be a permanent resident at the same time. And that's important to keep in mind. The main thing is that you would want to be able to convince an officer that you will not overstay your time period in Canada. And that's probably the most important consideration, I would say, from a dual intent perspective. The other consideration is that whether you need to work or not. So if you are coming in for a 7 or 8 month period of time, then you need to be able to show that if you're claiming that you don't need a work permit, you need to be able to show that you have the means to not be able to work, or next slide, you're working remotely. Now, remote work, next slide. Okay, well, I'll go through just the differences between remote work. So it's great because the Canadian government has made some progress in terms of clarifying this requirement. Generally speaking, if you are if you're claiming that you don't need a work permit, you can work. They refer to it as long distance work by telephone or internet, and it's done by a temporary resident whose employer is outside the country and who is remunerated outside the country. And self-employed individuals are also eligible, but the way that they word it, the guidance isn't very clear. It just says, you're not really going to impact the Canadian labor market by having your business and operating it within the country. So I would say the real guidance that you should focus on is who's going to pay you, where is your employer, and what impact are you having on the Canadian labor market, in the sense that are you competing actively with a Canadian to provide your business or your intangible work product. Now, it's very straightforward, and we've seen a lot of officers providing a visitor record for individuals who are able to show that they have a job outside the country, that they are going to continue to be paid working remotely, and they're just working on their laptop. They could be anywhere. The fact that they're in Canada doesn't make a difference. And I think that's kind of like a good litmus test to use in terms of remote work and that possibility. Now, that's really an important key consideration, because as I mentioned earlier, if you're doing an inside Canada application, that is when that's the only time you can also apply for a work permit. And I just wanted to touch upon processing time for that. And processing time there used to be 3 to 4 months, and now it is looking more like 6 to 8. So it is a little bit more difficult, and that might be the determining factor as to what type of process you choose. Ultimately, I think the most important thing is to keep in mind that there are the 2 options available. It's really important, especially if you have cross-border, you're anticipating a lot of cross-border travel, to really think through some of the considerations we touched upon. So on the screen, we just have a slide for the permanent resident process. And essentially the first process is really focused on the sponsor and the sponsor's eligibility. That will really be looking at whether the sponsor has had any prior undertakings, have sponsored other people in the past, and those types of factors. And then we switch to the principal applicant's eligibility as well. The last thing I wanted to touch upon before we open up to questions is just children. So children are included in the application with the spouse. And if, for instance, you had a child, you're a Canadian citizen who was born in Canada or is a Canadian citizen at the time that your child is born in the United States, then at that point, they're first generation born abroad. Most cases, they're eligible for Canadian citizenship, and you can submit an application for a citizenship certificate. That basically just commemorates and confirms that they are a Canadian, and that's from the time of birth that they are a Canadian. So what you would do in those circumstances, let's say you have applied and it's taking 6 to 8 months to get that certificate, then you can also provide evidence that that has been that application has been submitted. That's it. So I know I'm sure we have a lot of questions, so I'll wrap up my portion.
Thank you so much to both of you. I don't know for this audience, but everyone's still on the line, so it seems to me they've seen a lot of value in both of your presentations. If you do have questions and you're still with us, please put them in the chat. We'll be reading them one at a time. You were right, Pavan, we already have a few that have come in already, so I'll go through those. The first one is for you, Matt, actually. So as we are planning to build a financial plan to potentially involve both Canadian and US taxes, should we be assuming an average tax rate, or is there a financial planning software that we can use for cross-border taxation?
Well, okay, the second first, which is there is no financial planning software for cross-border taxation. We use a combination of software, but even then you have to do a lot of modeling to be able to analyze properly all the different kinds of nuances of cross-border tax. When you're moving to Canada, if you're a U.S., sounds like this person who asked the question is still a U.S. person, i.e. US citizen moving to Canada. If they want to get a sense of what their tax rate is, it's likely going to be the Canadian tax rate, because the Canadian rate is higher, and because they can get what's called a foreign tax credit to offset the lower U.S. taxes, as I was describing, most likely a U.S. citizen in Canada should be thinking about the Canadian rates as it keeps it simpler for them. And that's all going off of the assumption that they're not stuck in income tax traps, right? Because if they're in an income tax trap, then they're going to pay that rate and then pay some more US on top. So if you've gotten the right kind of planning and done in advance to ensure you don't have any traps, and you want to get a sense, it's most likely the Canadian rates. But even then, there's all kinds of special modeling for certain kinds of income that would have to be applied on top of that.
Got it. So the general rule of thumb is the Canadian tax rate is usually higher, so that's probably what you will be taxed. However, some sources of income are treated differently in the US and may have an additional tax because of that. And I would add one more thing. My understanding is also that it's different by state, correct? So if you're a California resident, if you're a New York resident, there's also some nuance there as well.
Yeah, it's definitely different by state. I mean, I'm making the assumption first coming back to Canada is no longer in the state. And actually, it's a good point, because unlike the federal side, the IRS, which I was describing, never lets you go if you're a citizen. The states do let you go. They do let you go. So that's one place. And that's also why there's a bigger gap between the Canadian and US rates, because the Canadian rates you're paying federal and provincial, where on the US side, you're theoretically just paying federal on an ongoing basis. Unless you're working in a given state on an ongoing basis, then there's a whole nother layer of complexity. But for most who would back, they couldn't be working in the US anymore.
Got it. One more question on this. Is there any general advice for Canadians moving back to Canada from the US with regards to keeping a US bank account for their USD?
Right, so that type of question is really, it's hinting around at the core point of residency. This person's wondering, is that creating any problems from a residency standpoint? Because and the general answer is not usually an issue. Okay, so I didn't get into too much detail on residency, but I talked about it being a nuanced and fact-driven, and you want to be able to demonstrate to both tax departments where you're really resident. And if your lifestyle and your facts are pointing you to Canada, you want to be able to show the US and most specifically a state like California that you're not living there anymore. Some of you are California residents, it's a very high rate of tax there. So, generally speaking, that understanding the treaty and how the tiebreakers work without going into detail right now, that leaving a bank account by itself is not going to be determinative. It's totally doable. It's like, where's your job, where's your house, where's your driver's license, health insurance, some of these other, your spouse, some of these other children. So we can end up with a bank account in both countries if it's all planned out well, and that's not going to be a big issue.
Got it. Thank you. Pavan, a question for you. Could you address entering Canada from the US by land? Currently, with ArriveCan application, is this a full quarantine requirement as well, or is the app only for air travel?
It's for both. I would recommend having it in any case. I found it really helpful. Plus, it gives you like a little serial number when you enter as well, and you can provide it to the officer. So by the time you scan your passport, all this information pops up on their screen about where you'll be staying, all of those types of things, and it's contactless as well, which is helpful.
So even if you're driving through the border, you have to isolate for 14 days.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Everybody has to isolate for 14 days. My apologies, I misunderstood the question.
So you answered the question, but I was in addition to that. So
okay.
Not only does it apply when you're traveling by land, but you also have to quarantine, correct?
Yes, and the quarantine requirement is for everyone. So whether you're Canadian and or a foreign national, you still need to quarantine for that 14 days, except in Alberta, where you have the potential option if you sign up in advance of doing rapid testing instead. And that's only through the Calgary and Coutts border.
And there was a point in time where our land borders were closed, but is that no longer the case? We can now travel by land?
Yeah, and I think they were always open. It was more just the fact that there was, I think the messaging by the Canadian government, especially, was that they do not want you to travel, or they want you to just return home, but don't travel for any other reason. And I think that might have led to some of the confusion. But you can definitely enter by land or by air. One question I often get is, which is better? I would say, well, one, if you're going by plane and you're symptomatic, then they can deny you entry and deny you boarding, sorry, not entry. And then if you're at a land border and you're a Canadian who is symptomatic, they still will allow you into the country. But that just is more of an example of the fact that if you're going by air, you have to keep in mind that the airlines have their own rules and restrictions, and they're actually heavily fined if there is any type of issue where they let somebody on where they should not.
Got it. A pretty simple question, but I wondered the same thing when I arrived here. In terms of the quarantine requirements, what are the restrictions for traveling from the airport to your residence of quarantine? Can you take a public transit or an Uber?
Yeah, so it's if you go to different parts of the website, it has different examples, the Canadian government website. So I'm not surprised there's a lot of confusion. The main, so I know people who have successfully taken public transportation, but it is not recommended. But then at the same time, I think the best way is private transportation that you have procured on your own. But if that's something that's not possible for everyone, so you can take an Uber or a taxi as well. They do recommend keeping your windows open, having gloves and masks and things like that if possible.
Matt, a question for you. How difficult is it to renounce US citizenship once you're back in Canada while retaining your Canadian citizenship to reduce your US tax exposure? And will future travel to the US be limited?
Yeah, great question. And usually, I've said it when I'm in my consultations with US citizens, at some point during the hour, it comes out going through the different tax traps. They say, well, is there a way out of this US tax status? And the person asking the question is talking about that, which is you can actually renounce your US citizenship, and it's not for everybody. Of course, a lot of people feel very, a lot of personal and family ties to the US, but in certain cases, people are open to that. And if you were going to renounce, you can renounce. The tax issues are, that you could have an exit tax if you are over certain thresholds. And if the thresholds are, if your net worth more than 2 million US, okay, you could be okay, there's a status called a covered expatriate, which you don't want, okay? And you'd be a covered expatriate if you're either over 2 million US, you have an average tax over the last 5 years of 160K federal tax, which is hard to do, not 160K of income, 160K of tax. So that's a good position to be in. Some people are there, but not many. And then the last one is if you also would be a covered expatriate if you had not properly filed your last 5 years US tax returns. So you don't want any of those three criteria to be true. The first one is the most likely that people will hit, which is the $2 million in net worth. And if you are those things, then you'd be a covered expatriate, which could lead you to an exit tax. And also, which worse than the exit tax, could be a 40% tax for whenever you leave money to a US citizen when you die, which is maybe your kids or your spouse or kids most likely. So you don't want to be a covered expatriate. Now we have strategies to get you out of that status if it sounds like you're going to be hitting that. And if we can get out of the covered expatriate status, then you can give up the citizenship and then do all the stuff that other Canadians can do, mutual funds, TFSAs, and many other things. Now, if you have one spouse who's not a Canadian, like I call it almost like in my cross-border context, a mixed marriage, one US, one non-US, right? And the non-US spouse is able to do stuff. Maybe that's also your situation. I was asking the question, is that like you can, even though you're stuck with certain traps, you can kind of compensate by having the spouse do certain things. Like RESP is another one that's tricky for a US citizen, but the spouse can have that one. With respect to the issues about traveling.
You give up your US citizenship then? It sounds like it is.
Well, there's tax planning around it. And then there's the actual process itself with, takes time to get an appointment at the embassy, the consulate where they do it. And they've actually increased the government has increased the fees from like a few $100s to several, like $5,000 or $3,000 or $4,000. I can't remember, but it exorbitantly jumped like hundreds of percent in terms of what they were charging just from the administrative government side. So there's those pieces to it. And then the last thing that the person asked is about, can I travel afterwards, right? It's probably a US immigration question. I'm not a US immigration lawyer, but I know certain things about this particular issue, and that there is something on the books. I think it's called the HART Act. And it says that if you gave up your citizenship, you expatriated for tax reasons, then theoretically they may be able to bar you from entry, but apparently that's almost the thing happened one time and it's being litigated. So it seems to be a quite like more a scare tactic that's not enforced, but that is out there. That's some point to the to speak to the issue that person asked.
Got it. Thank you so much. Pavan, a question for you. Wondering two things. What is the processing time for an outland application, and how much flexibility is there in the relocation date?
So that's a great question. I wish I knew the answer to the first one. It's a question that I get almost on a daily basis. It's really hard to predict right now. The one thing I would say is that the Canadian government acknowledged that this was an issue. And they started to create a pilot project that is supposed to really expedite the process for the backlog that we have. And so I'm hoping it starts to go down, but right now we're anticipating double the time, and so probably more than a year. Is what we're considering. Now, for the second question, which is a really interesting one about how much flexibility you have to relocate. So when you are, you can sponsor, a citizen can sponsor somebody while they're living outside the country with the intention of moving back. Now, but that intention to move back has to be usually demonstrated in some way. So we would recommend carrying, for instance, or not carrying, providing, for instance, some information about like speaking, maybe applications for a job, those types of things, like a real genuine intent. You have to declare the intent, but then also we recommend providing those like documentation. And if you don't provide it, then, you know, once it comes to that stage where the application is going to be considered, they will, and they start actually processing it rather than just being in a backlog, they will bring that up, and you will need to show your plan. Now, no one, I don't think it would be realistic either to say, okay, so we've waited for 12 months, or maybe it might, we know we might take like 2 years, and as soon as you get it, you have to be on the plane and move to Canada. So there's some inherent flexibility there. I think it would just be a matter of reasonableness, which is always difficult to quantify. But I think as long as you can, and if for some reason it gets delayed, you know, the process is that the person who becomes a permanent resident, they get approved, they get something that's called a confirmation of permanent residence. Then they take that form right now to the port of entry, and that is when they become a permanent resident. After that, they have the flexibility to move. So that step will be taken. In interesting news, the government just announced that they will be moving towards an electronic landing protocol, which is what we call the process of actually activating your permanent resident status.
Okay. We have many more questions to go. Maybe we take another 7 minutes to get through them, and then I'll also invite people to reach out to both of you if they have outstanding questions or would like to work. You've both been phenomenal. Really appreciate your time. So just a couple more, if that's okay with both of you. A quick confirmation. It currently takes a US-born child to obtain Canadian citizenship 6 to 8 months. Is that correct? Yes.
Yeah, it's taking quite a bit of time. I would say if you have an urgent need for entering the country, there's the other thing you can do is seek urgent processing, but make it extremely clear on both the inside of your application and the application, the envelope as well, that you're seeking urgent processing. For instance, if you have a job offer in Canada and you need to move as soon as possible, those types of things.
Okay. Matt, a question for you. Is there a way to receive the foreign tax credit if you reside in Canada for less than 330 days?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it comes back to I guess, residency, right? So if you're a Canadian resident and the income that you're earning is Canadian sourced, then you should be able to obtain a foreign credit on the US side. So like, maybe I'll just take a minute here because a lot of questions about residency, and I had to go through it very quickly. But as I was saying, it comes back to the treaty. The treaty is the key for residency. And inside the treaty, there's a series of tiebreakers that help delineate which country you're really resident of. And the first one is, where's your permanent home? And that really just means, where is the home available to you? Either you could have something in Canada that you either are renting or you own, but if it's available to you, it's a home. And so, if you have a home available to you in Canada, you don't have one in the US, well, you're probably under the treaty a Canadian resident, not a US. But if you have homes in both, it would go to the second tiebreaker, which is, where is the center of your vital interests? That's your personal and economic ties. And that's your job, your spouse, your driver's license, health insurance. And then if that wasn't clear, it would go to the third tiebreaker, which is, where is your habitual abode? And that means, where are you spending most of your time? And again, if that one wasn't clear still, it would go to the tiebreaker, which is, where's your citizenship? So it's about analyzing the residency really carefully. It's going to drive everything about when you become a resident, the timing of residency, how we're going to tell that story. And if this person's asking, can I still be a Canadian resident and get a foreign tax credit even though I can't? Yes, I think what the person might be talking about is something else called the foreign earned income exclusion. I think that's what they're talking about. It's an alternative to the foreign tax credit method, which is, if you have income and you're living in Canada as a US citizen and your income is under about 100K, you could just use something called the foreign earned income exclusion, and it basically excludes your income from the US tax side. And there's a rule there of being in Canada more than 330 days, or out of the US. So I think that's what that person's asking. And the answer is, you might not be able to use the foreign earned income exclusion, which is the first time I'm talking about that today. but you can always use foreign tax credits.
Got it. That makes sense. Another one for you. If a Canadian citizen moves back to Canada and leaves their investments in the US, can they still buy and sell within their investment accounts while they are living in Canada?
Oh, a great question. So, again, just touched on, I didn't get a chance to go deep into it, but it's good it's coming up here, which is for someone who's moving between Canada and the US, you're transitioning to Canada. In theory, your portfolio also has to go through a transition to be more Canadian resident centric. And that means a few things. Like, one issue is like, well, you might be, 100% in US dollars because you've been living in the US, investing in the US, and now you're living in Canada, you might need to be more Canadian dollars, because if you're spending all your money when you're going to Tim Hortons or wherever, and it's in Canadian, that's what they take, you're gonna need Canadian dollars, of course, for your expenses and your lifestyle. So you need a bit of a mix. So currency's in there, but I think it's really gonna drive what this person's asking is, the money in your brokerage account usually moves from the US accounts to a Canadian custodian, okay? And the reason is twofold. One is, remember the residency story I was telling? Well, where is your brokerage account is another residency tie. And usually, again, we want to tell that story in a systematic way that you're a Canadian resident, other factors. But the biggest driver of why the money moves to Canadian custodian usually is because the manager or the financial institution that you've got your money with is not compliant to manage the assets for someone living in Canada. They're not registered with the Ontario Securities Commission or the Autorité Marché Financier in Quebec or BC regulator on the security side there. So as soon as you change your address, they're gonna, like, even though the manager may say, oh, I think I can help you, change the address, that manager is going to get a tap on the shoulder from their compliance department saying, well, we're not licensed. So you really want to be with a licensed cross-border portfolio management team. It's something we can assist with, have a whole program around investment oversight on that, and get ahead of that. Because as soon as you know you're moving, you don't want to all of a sudden be trapped, right? As you're moving or right after you're moving, to just redo your portfolio because it's not able to be managed down there anymore.
Got it. A lot to think about. Thanks, Matt. Pavan, we'll close this conversation with 2 more questions for you. We'll try to keep our answers short so we can keep you all on schedule. So could you speak further to US citizens or green card holders temporarily physically located in Canada and must work for US-based companies? What, if any, are the Canadian implications with respect to the work carried out in Canada for US-based companies?
So that's a great question, something that we see a lot of, especially here where you have a number of people who are relocating who can travel anywhere right now because they're all remote. Is whether, and I think the kind of litmus test that I really use is like, can you be anywhere? Or, is there any benefit at all to what you're doing being physically located in Canada? And that's kind of like that nexus with the Canadian labor market and having that labor market entry. So if you have Canadian clients that you're working on, if you have Canadian subsidiaries, it's still possible to be classified work, but you should really need to have like a clear line. Like I just advised on this morning where I was like, don't go to the Canadian subsidiary office. Just causes more complications at that point. But I know you had another question, so.
Oh yeah. The last one will be, can US parents enter to visit dependent children on study permits? And do US students need to pay US taxes on Canadian earned income? I guess that's kind of a question for both of you. So let's start with entering the country to visit children on a student permit if they are US citizens.
So the US citizen entry on the study permit, I mean, it really depends on whether you're helping this, especially if it's a minor student, if you're helping them settle into the country or not. But it's really dependent upon the circumstances. You do need to have an essential purpose at that point.
And I guess this second half of the question was for you, Matt. Do US students need to pay US taxes on Canadian earned income while they're working in Canada?
Well, it's part of the privileges of being a US citizen. You're taxed on your worldwide income as a US citizen, student or not student. But actually the distinction is the students might not be a Canadian resident. When you're just studying, you're always a US tax person if you're a US citizen, but you might not be a Canadian resident if you're studying in Canada. But if you're, so when you're not a Canadian resident studying in Canada, the only thing you pay tax on in Canada is Canadian employment income, which is what that question was. So you're likely in that case to pay tax on Canadian employment income to Canada, and then, like I said, report your worldwide income to the US. You're never getting out of that unless you renounce. And then hopefully get, as I said, get a tax credit.
Yeah. Well, more questions trickling in, but I would like to invite everyone to reach out to both of you. Clearly, this was a very top of mind topic, and we are incredibly grateful for your time, for all this invaluable knowledge. And I can't, recommend the both of you enough. For anybody on the line who would like to immigrate to Canada and still has outstanding questions or would like the help of those two professionals with this, I know that I'm probably going to reach back out again soon, I'm sure. So thanks again for taking the time today. This session will be recorded, so please look out for that recording. And we look forward to speaking to all of you again soon.